Welcome to a brand new series, Peter and the Starcatchers, by Dave Barry and Ridley Pearson. This is a favorite story. It's a backstory of Peter Pan. So let's get started. Chapter 1, The Neverland. The tired old carriage, pulled by two tired old horses, rumbled onto the wharf, its creaky wheels bumpity-bumping on the uneven planks, waking Peter from his restless slumber. The carriage interior, hot and stuffy, smelled of 5 smallish boys and 1 largish man, none of whom was keen on bathing. Peter was the leader of the boys, because he was the oldest. Or maybe he wasn't. Peter had no idea how old he really was, so he gave himself whatever age suited him, and it suited him to always be 1 year older than the oldest of his mates. If Peter was 9, and a new boy came to St. Norbert's, home for wayward boys, who said he was 10, why then Peter would declare himself to be 11. Also, he could spit the farthest. That made him the undisputed leader. As leader, he made it his business to keep his eye on things in general, and he was not happy with the way things were shaping up today. The boys had been told only that they were going away on a ship. As much as Peter didn't like where he'd been living for the past 7 years, the longer this carriage ride lasted, the scarier away sounded in his mind. They set out from St. Norbert's in the dark, but now Peter could see grayish daylight through the small, round coach window on his side. He looked out squinting and saw a dark shape looming by the wharf. It looked to Peter like a monster, with tall spines coming out of its back. Peter did not like the idea of walking into the belly of that monster. "Is that it?" he asked. "This ship we're going on?" He ducked then, avoiding the ham-like right fist of Edward Gremkin. He was always keenly aware where this fist was. He'd been dodging it for 7 years now. Gremkin, second in command at St. Norbert's home for wayward boys, was a man of numerous rules, many of them invented right on the spot, all of them enforced by means of a swift cuff to the ear. He paid little attention to whose ear his fist actually landed on. All the boys were rule breakers as far as Gremkin was concerned. This time the fist clipped an ear belonging to a boy named Thomas, who had been slumped, half asleep in the carriage, next to the ducking Peter. "Ow!" said Thomas. "Do not end a sentence with a preposition," said Mr. Gremkin. He was also the grammar teacher at St. Norbert's. "But I didn't. Ow!" said Thomas, upon being cuffed a second time by Gremkin, who had a strict rule against back talk. For a moment the carriage was silent, except for the bumpity-bump. Then Peter tried again. "Sir," he said, "is that our ship?" He kept an eye on the fist in case ship turned out to be a preposition. Peter was thinking about trying to run away, but he didn't know if that was possible, to run away from away. In any event, he didn't see much opportunity for escape. There were sailors and dockhands everywhere, carts and carriages. Near the back of the ship, fancily dressed people boarded via a ramp with a rope handrail toward the bow. Pigs and a cow were being led up to a steep plank, followed by commoners dressed more like Peter and his friends. And Gremkin glanced out the round window and grinned, but not in a pleasant way. There wasn't a pleasant bone in his body. "Yes, that's your ship," he said, "the Neverland." "What's Neverland?" said a boy named Prentice, who was fairly new to the orphanage and thus did not see the fist until it hit his ear. "Ow!" he said. "Don't you be asking stupid questions," said Gremkin, who defined stupid questions as questions he could not answer. "All you need to know is this ship will be your home for the next 5 weeks. 5 weeks, sir?" "If you're lucky," said Gremkin, leaning out of the carriage now to study the sky. "If a storm doesn't blow you halfway to hell." He smiled again. "Or worse." "Worse than hell, sir?" inquired James. "He means that the ship sinks," said Tubby Ted, who had a gift for looking on the dark side, "and we wind up in the sea, swimming for our lives." "But I can't swim," said James. None of us can swim. I can swim, Tubby Ted declared proudly. You can float, corrected Peter. Even Grumpkin cracked a smile at that, yellow-toothed stumps showing through its chapped lips. Peter looked down the wharf and saw a much nicer-looking and bigger ship painting a shiny black. Its crew wore uniforms unlike that of the Neverland. It, too, was being loaded and seemed ready to set sail. If it came down to choosing between the two ships, it don't matter, said Grumpkin brightly, his mood improving. Swim, sink, float. The sharks will take care of all you boys before you get a chance to drown. Sharks? Said James. Big fish with lots of teeth, said Tubby Ted. They eat people. What if there's no people in the sea? Said Thomas. What do the sharks eat then? Whales, said Tubby Ted, but they like people better. And there's plenty of people in the sea. Ships is always going down. I heard about one. Ow! That's enough of your jabber, said Grumpkin, who had a rule against too much jabber. The carriage pulled to a stop beside the ship, as Grumpkin and the boys climbed out. A thick, bald man in a grimy officer's uniform thumped down the gangplank and approached the carriage. You, Grumpkin? He said. I am, said Grumpkin. And you are? Slink. William Slink, first officer, second in command of the Neverland. The man made a face, as if he'd just bitten into a rancid prune. It occurred to Peter that Slink didn't like being second in anything. These are the orphans, then? They are, said Grumpkin, and you're welcome to them. I don't care for boys, observed Slink. Then you'll definitely not care for these, said Grumpkin. We've had boys on board before, said Slink. They was always stirring up the rats. The boys glanced at one another. Rats. The thing to do, said Grumpkin, is keep them disciplined. To illustrate, he shot his fist sideways, not looking where it was going. It struck Prentice, who, being fairly new, had not yet learned that it was unwise to stand immediately to Grumpkin's right. Ow! Said Prentice. Sir, said James to Slink, there's rats on the ship? Don't you be playing with the rats, said Slink, cuffing James on the ear. They make a tasty treat when the food runs out. The food runs out? Asked Tubby Ted, suddenly reluctant to take another step. When? Slink slapped him across the ear and said, After we eat you. Grumpkin nodded approvingly, confident now that he was leaving the boys in good hands. Peter scanned the area for a place to run and hide. He saw a supply store offering pulleys and hemp rope. Some taverns, the Salty Dog, the Mermaid Song. Mermaids? Peter wondered. But everywhere he looked, there were sailors and dock workers, rough men with rough hands. He wouldn't get 10 paces before one of them would collar him, if Slink didn't collar him first. I'll be getting back to St. Norbert's, Grumpkin said. He turned toward the coach, paused for a moment, then turned back and said, You boys better watch out for yourselves. In 7 years, that was the nicest thing Peter had ever heard Grumpkin say. All right, said Slink, as Grumpkin turned back to the coach. You boys get on board. We're waiting for one more piece of cargo, and then we cast off. Peter eyed the nicer ship down the wharf. Some soldiers were approaching it carrying rifles with bayonets. The soldiers wore crisp blue uniforms and black, shiny boots. They walked on either side of a horse-drawn cart that carried a single trunk, black, done all around with chains and padlocks. The boys hesitated, taking their first good look at the Neverland. It wasn't as big as they'd expected, and it looked old and poorly kept. Frayed ropes, peeling paint, barnacles, and green slime climbing the hull from the waterline. Get a move on, said Slink. I can't swim, whispered James. We'll be all right, said Peter. It can't be worse than St. Norbert's. Yes, it can, said Tubby Ted. The food runs out. Sharks, Thomas reminded them. Rats. We'll be all right, repeated Peter, and he started up the gangplank, being the leader, but still thinking about finding a way to escape before the ship set sail. Chapter 2. The Second Trunk. Not far down the wharf from the Salty Dog and the Mermaid's Song, two men toiled in a dark, dismal warehouse. Its enormous doors opened to the harbor and the ships that were preparing for departure. "Are we done, then?" asked Alf, the bigger of the two. He had a nose wart the size and shape of a small mushroom, "because I could use some grog." Alf, being a sailor, could always use some grog. "Not yet," said Mac. "Slank says we got one more to get aboard. This one over here." Mac, a thin man but as strong as any hand on the Neverland, had a tattoo of a snake's head on his neck, the snake's body disappearing into his sour clothes. Mac pointed to a corner of the warehouse where a filthy canvas was draped over a bulky object. The two men trudged over. Mac grabbed a corner of the canvas and pulled it off, revealing a common-looking trunk made of rough wood, but held shut by thick chains and secured by three padlocks. Alf studied the trunk, frowning. "Ain't this the trunk them soldiers brought in here this morning?" he asked. "It looks like it," said Mac, "but it ain't. There was two trunks come in together. The black one got loaded onto the Wasp by them soldiers. Heavy as lead it was. Then Slank pulls me aside and says he wants us, real careful like, to put this one aboard the Neverland. He says tie the canvas tight around it and walk it up the main gangway like it belongs to one of the travelers. He says if we do this right, there's 2 bob more in our pay." "A piece?" said Alf. "A piece," said Mac. "All right, then," said Alf, who was not one to ask questions when 2 bob were involved. "Let's tie her up, then," said Mac. "You lift the end there, and I'll tuck the canvas underneath and slip the rope round it." "Why don't you lift the end?" said Alf. "It's me back, Alf," complained Mac. "You know how it troubles me." "No more than mine troubles me," said Alf. "But I said it first," said Mac. Alf sighed. The longer they argued, and Alf knew from experience that Mac would argue this point a good long time, the less chance he'd have at some grog before they set sail. "All right, then," Alf said, and he squatted to grab hold of the end of the trunk. Alf was a simple man, of simple wants. What he hoped to get from life was food that was soft enough to chew, a place to sleep out of the rain, and some grog now and again. Alf had never known true happiness, and he didn't expect to. And so he was not ready at all, for what happened when his rough, callous hands touched the trunk. First he felt it, a warmth starting in his hands, but quickly moving up his arms and down his back and into his legs, and everywhere the warmth went. It was wonderful, like stepping into a bath. In an instant, the pain in his bent old spine, the throbbing pain that he'd lived with since almost his first day on the docks, was gone. So was the aching weariness in his legs gone. But there was more. There was a smell. It was flowers, new grass in a meadow right after a spring rain, a fresh orange being peeled. It was cinnamon and honey and bread just baked and pulled from the oven, and another smell even more wonderful than all the others, though Alf couldn't place it. Like nighttime, he thought. Alf could see light now swirling around his head, colors and sparkles moving to music, dancing to the sound of bells. Yes, it was bells, tiny ones by the sound of them, and it was a sweet and joyful sound, though Alf could hear something else in it, something that seemed to be trying to tell Alf something. He strained to hear it. He wanted to hear it. "Alf!" said Mac, shaking Alf's shoulder harder now, hard enough so that Alf let go of the trunk, and when he did, the wonderful smells were gone, and so were the lights and the bells, and Alf could feel the weight come back into his body, his back and his arms and his legs, along with all the old aches and pains, and he felt himself settling, as though he'd been, but that was impossible, floating above the warehouse floor. Just a little bit of an inch, but floating. He brushed off his hands, thinking someone had put rat poison on the outside of the trunk. He'd seen sailors go into a crazy dance for messing with rat poison. "Alf," said Mac again, "what's wrong with you?" Alf looked at Mac, then down at the trunk, then back at Mac. He put his fingers in both ears, looking silly. When I touched it," Alf said. "Didn't you hear them?" "Hear what?" said Mac. "The bells," said Alf. "What bells?" said Mac. "There were no bells." "Bells," said Alf, "and lights, and—" He stopped, seeing the way Mac was looking at him. "Rat poison," he said, slapping his hands against his pants, trying to get them clean. "You already been to the tavern today?" asked Mac suspiciously. "Rat poison," said Alf, now rubbing his hands on a dirty old towel. Mac was looking at him all funny. "Got to get it off me hands." "Bells," Mac teased him, shaking his head. He turned back to the trunk. Alf saw that Mac had slipped the canvas more tightly around the trunk, and the rope around the canvas. A tiny bit of the trunk still showed. "Mac," said Alf, "I dares you to touch it." "What?" said Mac. "Me? Just touch the trunk," said Alf. "On the wood there." "I'm not messing with no rat poison. You remember what happened to Hungry Bob?" Mac considered himself a cautious man, and the truth was, he was afraid to touch the trunk now. He knew that something had happened when Alf touched it. Somehow he felt it. No, Mac had decided there was something strange about this trunk. Why else would Slank be giving special orders and offering to Bob? Mac was not going to touch it. "Thank you very much. It's not our job to fool with it," Mac said, pulling the rope tight. The canvas was now covered the trunk entirely. "Slank said put it aboard the Neverland, and that's that." "But Mac," said Alf, "I'm telling you, God's truth, rat poison or not, it felt good." "Let's just finish the job," said Mac, pulling the knot tight. "And take our two Bob to the tavern, get her grog quick like, and forget about this trunk." "All right then," said Alf, though he didn't think he would soon forget that feeling he'd just had. Maybe once the Neverland was under way, he could sneak in and visit this trunk again. Grunting, the two men lifted the canvas-wrapped trunk onto a handcart and trundled it out of the warehouse onto the wharf. A minute later, they passed the Wasp, whose crew was preparing to cast off. "She's a pretty ship, ain't she?" said Mac. "What?" said Alf, who had been thinking about the trunk. "I say, the Wasp is a beauty," said Mac. "I'd love to sail on her some day. They say she's the only ship afloat that might outrun the Sea Devil." The mention of the pirate ship won Alf's full attention. The Sea Devil was a ship of the most feared pirate on the seven seas. Sailors said that if you caught sight of the Sea Devil, it was time to make your peace with your maker, because you'd be with him within the hour. "No ship can outrun the Sea Devil," said Alf. "Nobody has ever, and nobody ever has." "Till now," said Mac. The Wasp was built for just that, and Captain Scott is an able seaman, as ever sailed these waters, unlike the idjit in charge of our bilge bucket." Sneering, Mac nodded toward the Neverland, now just ahead. "Aye," said Alf. "Pembridge could capsize a dinghy on dry land." Cyrus Pembridge, the Neverland's captain, was widely regarded as the most incompetent man to command a ship since the formation of water. "Who in the name of common sense would put to sea on that ship with that man in charge?" wondered Mac. "Well," Alf answered, "we are." "True," Mac said, "but nobody else hired the likes of us." They were alongside the Neverland now. The ship had been loaded and provisioned. The crew was prepping to cast off. Most of the passengers were on deck. Some were looking around anxiously at the decrepit ship and the scruffy crew in whose hands they were placing their lives. Others were leaning on the dockside rail, watching the cast-off preparations. Among these, Alf noticed, was a group of 5 boys near the bow. They looked plainly scared, except for one, a wiry boy with bright orange hair. Not the largest of the lot, but the one who seemed to be in charge. He had an air about him, Alf thought, the look of a boy who doesn't miss much. "It's about time," said Slank, tromping down the gangplank, trailed by 2 more seamen. "You're late. Tide's begun to run." To the men behind him he said, "Get this cargo trunk aboard." As the men bent to heft the load, Alf, not thinking, not knowing why he did it, slipped his hand under the canvas flap, thrusting it forward. Under his fingers felt the smooth wood. "Here now," said Slank. "What the dickens are you doing?" "Alf," said Mac, "what are you doing?" But Alf didn't hear them. Instantly he was lost in it all again, the warmth and the smells, the music and the floating, and it was so good, especially this sweet song. There was something else in there, too, something the bells were saying, trying to tell him. What was it? "Hands off that cargo!" Slank yelled. Alf felt himself yanked away from the trunk, and then the music was gone and all the other good feelings with it. Alf was wobbly, but with Mac's help he managed to keep his feet. Alf watched two men carry the trunk onto the ship, and he felt a sadness come over him because he knew he might not hear the music again. He almost wept, except that a man like Alf didn't cry. Then, he didn't know why, Alf looked toward the bow and found himself looking right into the startlingly blue eyes of the orange-haired boy. "Come on, Alf," said Mac, gently tugging at Alf's coat, concerned about his old friend's strange behavior. But for a moment, Alf held still, his gaze still locked with that of the orange-haired boy. "Come on," repeated Mac. "We're casting off." Alf turned and followed his friend toward the lines that held the ship to the wharf. After a few steps he looked back, but the boy was gone. "Boys get into all sorts of trouble," he thought, his ears still ringing from the music of those bells. That's the end of our reading today. Be sure to subscribe so that you will be notified when we start Chapter 3, Molly.